Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I'm Connie Kimmerer, and some of you will remember me as the founder and chair of the Teton Wellness Institute and Festival. I'm honored to welcome you to Eat, Drink, and Vote with Dr. Marion Nestle, and that is the name of one of her books, too. This evening is brought to you by St. John's Wellness Department as part of their Words on Wellness program and SHIFT. A bit of history. The Teton Wellness Institute, in collaboration with St. John's Medical Center, started the CHI Center, the Community Health Information Center, which today has grown into a whole wellness department, staffed by 3 people and led by Julia Heemstra, assisted by Rachel Green and Sarah Salo. And we especially need to thank Rachel Green, but all of them have put a lot of work into getting Marion here. Now you can clap again. This team runs programs for the staff and patients at St. John's, plus Workside Wellness for the Teton County School District and the Teton Science School. They also lead the health fair, lunchtime learnings, Words on Wellness speaker series, and they're working with a community health assessment. So they do a great job for us in this community. I'm also honored to introduce Dr. Annie Fenn, beloved obstetrician, turned foodie. And Annie is responsible for all of the FoodSHIFT events. So if you recall, she did a fantastic job of interviewing Michael Pollan 2 years ago. And tonight she will introduce and interview Dr. Marion Nestle. So now we clap for her. Here you go, Annie.
Good evening, everybody. It's so nice to see so many friends here. Thank you, Connie, for introducing me, and thanks to everyone at St. John's Medical Center for bringing in Dr. Marion Nestle. We're pleased to have her as part of our SHIFT Festival. I am absolutely thrilled to be able to be the one to introduce her. Dr. Marion Nestle is at the top of my list of food heroes in America. And mentioning Michael Pollan, she's at the top of Michael Pollan's list as well. He just named her the #2 most powerful foodie in Forbes magazine. Does anybody know who #1 is? Michelle Obama. So she's the #1 most powerful foodie who does not live in the White House. Well, that's pretty good. We are a community that cares deeply about what we eat and what we feed our children. But many of you may not be aware of how much Marion Nestle has influenced the way we think about food. In a career that began by teaching nutrition classes in the 1970s, Dr. Nestle has become one of the key voices in food policy, nutrition, and food education in this country. Dr. Nestle is a molecular biologist by training. She holds a master's in public health and nutrition. She's a nutrition scientist, a researcher, and a Paul Goddard professor at New York University. She was the first person in the country to start a food studies program at NYU in the mid-1990s. And now I understand most universities have food studies programs. She is the author of many books, including What to Eat, Eat, Drink, Vote, Pet Food Politics, and her most groundbreaking book of all, which is Food Politics. It was just released in its 10th anniversary edition. By the way, Dr. Marion Nestle is not related to the Nestle Corporation, which makes candy bars, instant coffee, a long list of processed foods. Dr. Nestle has spent much of her career fighting to stop corporations from marketing junk food like that to children. In the 1990s, she served as a nutrition policy advisor in the Department of Health and Human Services. While listening to a presentation about how cigarette companies market to children, she realized that junk food was being marketed to children in the exact same way. The first time you heard about pink slime, it's most likely because Dr. Nestle was one of the first to write about it in the San Francisco Chronicle and in the Atlantic. If you follow the controversy about genetically modified foods, you know that Dr. Nestle has provided a much-needed scientific input into that debate. Over the years, whenever a new study comes out linking a certain food or nutrient to another health problem, or more commonly claiming to be healthful, everyone turns to Marion Nestle for an unbiased scientific opinion. Marion has written about how to navigate a supermarket that is designed to sell you more calories than you need. She has written about tackling the obesity epidemic by examining the food environment in America, a term she coined that describes the overabundance of low-quality, high-calorie, cheap food everywhere. Has anyone seen the movie Fed Up? It's playing in town this week. Yeah. You see Marion in Fed Up? If you get a chance, it's also on Netflix now. Check out this movie. It's about the plight of childhood obesity in America. It's incredible. Marion Nestle has brought attention to the problem of hunger in America. She has taken on each iteration of the government's food pyramid with scientific facts and a good dose of humor. When I was practicing medicine here, I often looked to Marion's work for common sense advice about how to counsel patients about nutrition. As a writer, Marion's work has inspired me to write not just about food and recipes, but also about cultivating a vibrant food culture, choosing the best foods for our families, and caring about where our food comes from. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marion Nestle, speaking tonight about what to eat, what to feed your kids, and how it affects your community.
Thank you, Annie, for that incredibly embarrassing introduction. And I thought you were going to mention that Connie and Annie and I went bike riding this afternoon. This is my first trip to Jackson Hole, and I just want to tell you, I get it. And I really want to thank all of you. I get it so much that I understand what it means for you to be inside listening to this. So thank you very much for that. And thank you, Connie, and the St. John's team for making this possible. I thought what I would do, this was the title that I was given, and it's taken some doing to try to figure out what to do with it. But I thought what I would do would be to talk about the way I think about these issues. And I think about food issues from the standpoint of what we academics call food systems. And by food systems, we mean everything about food from production to consumption, agriculture, food, nutrition, all the way to public health. When I was doing my training in public health, it took me a long time to get agriculture. I was a little slow on that. I didn't understand why you needed to know about agriculture to understand how people eat in America. But now I think they're just completely and inextricably linked. And the reason for that has to do with the two most important public health problems in the world. I know we're all really worried about Ebola these days, and that makes us forget that the two public health problems that affect the largest number of people in the world are, on the one hand, food insecurity is what it's called these days, not having enough to eat, and on the other hand, having so much that you become obese. And the common cause of both of these problems are inequities in the food system. And these inequities are, I'll be talking about what some of these inequities are. Let me say something first about food insecurity on a worldwide basis. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN has just come out with its annual report on the state of food insecurity in the world. And the great news that it has is only 805 million people in the world are chronically undernourished. I emphasize the only there, somewhat sarcastically, but that actually represents a decrease of 200 million since the year 2000, if you believe FAO's figures, which I must say not everybody does. But let's look at the United States situation. In the United States, the Department of Agriculture just a couple of weeks ago came out with its annual report. 14% of the US population is considered to be food insecure, and by the Department of Agriculture's definition, food insecurity means not having a reliable legal source of food, legally obtained source of food on a daily basis. And that it also affects a total of 10% of United States children, which doesn't sound like a very high percent until you multiply that by the number of children, and then it's millions of children. People who are food insecure are more likely to be low income. Obviously, they're also more likely to be minority, and paradoxically, they're more likely to be overweight or obese. One of the strange paradoxes that we're dealing with these days. So in preparation for this talk, I looked up Jackson Hole statistics. And Teton County is the healthiest in Wyoming. I can see why. Because only 10% of you smoke on average, only 13% are obese, compared to 30-something percentage for the average in America. 89% of you are very active, which sort of is an explanation for everything. And the median household income is $68,000, which is much, much higher than the median income in most of the communities in America. That's the upside. On the downside, excess drinking affects 21% of the population here. Gotta watch that. And 14% of children in the county live in poverty, which is higher than the national average. So that brings me to the inequity issue, which has to do with this growing socioeconomic disparity in dietary quality between the haves and the have-nots in this country. And that's something that I think we all need to be very concerned about. So a lot of this has to do with nutrition policy. And nutrition policy in the United States these days is represented by Choose My Plate Gov, which has as part of the policy, make half your plate fruits and vegetables. Oh, what that we could. Kind of difficult if you've got 9 months of winter, but never mind. Dietary advice, if you're worried about weight, is really very simple. It's eat less. If you're worried about weight, eat better, which I'll talk about in a minute, and move more. So moving more, you're taken care of here. Oh, and please don't eat my book. But if it seems more complicated than that, it's surely because of the ambiguities around eating better. And so eating better means more of real foods, whole foods, fruits and vegetables, and less of highly processed, what we call junk foods. But the problem with that kind of advice is that junk foods are far more profitable than the kinds of foods that are recommended. And the food industry knows that. And this was beautifully explained a few years ago by an executive of Coca-Cola who explained to an interviewer from Advertising Age, the magazine for the advertising industry, that obesity had become the Achilles heel of the food industry. It used to be something that they could ignore completely and blame on personal responsibility. If you're fat, it's your fault. And now it's clear that they have to pay very close attention to accusations and increasing amounts of evidence that food industry marketing practices have a great deal to do with the way people eat, especially the way people eat badly. And this is also shown by Coca-Cola in its annual filing to, of all things, the Security and Exchange Commission. Every year, corporations that are publicly traded have to turn in reports to the SEC and confess the factors in society that are likely to have bad effects on their profits. And at the end of 2013, Coca-Cola listed obesity as the #1 impediment to its profits, because public health officials and government officials who are worried about obesity are advising people to drink less soda, and people are drinking less soda, and that's very, very bad for business. American agricultural policy is very complicated. And on the one hand, we have my plate and people telling Americans to eat more fruits and vegetables. On the other hand, we have agricultural policy, which gives 0.45% of federal subsidies to fruits and vegetables, quite a bit less than what tobacco gets, whereas corn and other grains fed to animals get the great bulk of federal agricultural subsidies. And so I believe that this is one of the factors that has led to the rise in obesity, and the rise in obesity can be shown in this figure. And I'm going to start a lot of the graphs and charts that I'm showing with 1980 and with an arrow pointing to 1980, because in the early 1980s there were many changes in policy that took place that have created a food environment that promotes eating too much and eating too much of the wrong kinds of food. The first deregulation was of agriculture. In the late 1970s, agricultural subsidies changed from paying farmers not to grow food to paying farmers to grow as much food as they possibly could. And the result of that was mountains of corn and a sea of farm subsidies and a lot more calories in the food supply. So that's the first one. A second one, oddly enough, was deregulation of Wall Street. In the early 1980s, there was what was called a shareholder value movement, where the people who held shares in publicly traded corporations got tired of blue chip stocks that gave long, slow return on investment, and instead began to demand higher and more immediate returns on investment. And for food companies, this was especially difficult because food companies were already selling food in an environment in which there were way too many calories, roughly twice as many calories in the food supply as the country needed. And now they not only had to make a profit, but they had to sell so much food that their profits would grow every quarter. And you see the results of that in the business pages of newspapers. And the Wall Street is very tough on companies that don't meet their growth topics. But companies got a break. When President Reagan was elected in 1980, on a deregulatory agenda, one of the things that got deregulated was marketing to children. In 1978, the Federal Trade Commission, under the leadership of Michael Perchik, proposed to ban television ads to young children, all television marketing, to ban all television advertisements for sugary products, and to require balanced messages on TV, meaning that if you had a commercial that was promoting sugary products, you had to have another commercial that talked about why sugary products were bad for you. The idea that the Federal Trade Commission could do something like that now seems absolutely incredible. But they did, and the response of Congress was quite fierce. It closed down the FTC, it fired the commissioner, it reduced FTC's authority, and it passed a law preventing the FTC from making any rulemaking about marketing to children. And the result of that was that spending on marketing to children increased. Notice, early 1980s, an enormous increase in the amount of money spent on marketing in general and marketing to children in particular. So it's very difficult to get figures on how much money food companies spend on marketing in general, let alone marketing to children. But once a year, Advertising Age publishes a few figures, and I've given some examples here. Overall, the food and beverage and restaurant industries spend about $17 billion on marketing in general. And the figures that are shown underneath these logos or pictures of products are the amounts in millions that the company spends to advertise that product for 1 year. So PepsiCo spent $169 million to advertise Gatorade. Kellogg spent $32 million to advertise Pop-Tarts, and so forth. I can assure you that these numbers are much higher than any federal agency spends on anything promoting health. These are enormous numbers. And a lot of this is aimed at children, and here are two examples of products that are marketed to children. And I don't know, I just love them both. These are chocolate Teddy Grahams with calcium, iron, and zinc. They're a health food, right? And then a good source of vitamin D is Kellogg's Fruit Loops with marshmallows. You could be outside in the winter in Jackson Hole for 10 minutes and get all the vitamin D you need to get you through the winter. But this is marketing, and these things sell food products, and there's plenty of evidence that these kinds of health claims on food products make people think that the products don't have any calories and are health foods. So you have to do critical thinking when you go to a supermarket. But food companies did other things. They changed the environment of food choice, not out of evil intent, but just to try to sell more products in a greatly overheated marketplace. And this is a slide that was done by one of my doctoral students who measured the introduction of large-sized portions into the food supply, and then compared the introduction of these large-sized portions to the percent overweight in the population and the number of calories in the food supply that increased because of agricultural policy, and they all went up pretty much in parallel. This is guilt by association, and it's not supposed to be causal, but it seems to me that it's pretty obvious that if you have larger portions, you're going to be having more calories, and more calories are going to lead to overweight. And here's a slide that illustrates what to me is the one thing that I wish I could teach the American public, and that is larger portions have more calories. It's not obvious, and you're going to have to take it on trust that it's not intuitive. Oh no, I'm going to tell you an example of what happened. We asked my former doctoral student now teaches beginning nutrition at NYU, and she asked her class to tell her how many calories were in a 100-ounce soda, and how many calories were in a 8-ounce soda, and how many were in a 64-ounce soda. And she didn't expect them to know how many were in an 8-ounce soda. It's 100 calories, but she did expect them to multiply by 8. But even NYU undergraduates are not that mathematically challenged. But the average multiplier was 3. And when she went back to ask them why they didn't multiply by 8, they said 800 calories in a soda is impossible. It's impossible. It's not impossible. Sorry. Wish it were. But food companies changed the food environment in other ways. They took advantage of a long-term trend, starting in the 1930s and going all the way up to the present, of increasing proportions of the food dollars spent outside the home, and looking at what exactly they were buying outside the home. It was a tremendous increase in fast food from 1980 to the present, and if you look at that more closely, all of the increases in pizza. So you can account for rising rates of obesity with pizza, and you can also account for it with sodas. So sodas from 1980 to the present in the United States, Canada, and lots of other places increased enormously, and sodas have calories as well as everything else. So in general,
what food companies did was to put food everywhere. And I don't know how many of you have been to New York recently, but there's a Duane Reade drugstore on every corner in Manhattan, and they now increasingly look like grocery stores. More and more of the toothpaste is being crammed into little teeny aisles, and food is everywhere. Bed Bath & Beyond has an enormous food section, and Staples, at least in Manhattan, has large sections devoted to office snacks. So what all of this did out of the normal course of doing business was to change the parking lot from one that promoted healthy outdoor living to one that promoted overconsumption. And then, because we're interested in the inequity question, let me say something about prices. If you're going to go into McDonald's with approximately $5, it depends on where in the country you're doing this, you can buy with your $5 5 hamburgers or 1 salad. And you know, that should give you pause and say, how come? Okay, you have to keep salads cold and there's a lot of waste connected with it. But I think this has a lot to do with federal policy that makes the cost of some foods cheaper than the cost of others, and not only always the ones that nutritionists would recommend. And there's quite good data. If poor people think that the cost of fruits and vegetables is prohibitively expensive, there are very good data that show, and these data are based on indexes, that the indexed cost of fresh fruits and vegetables has gone up by 40% since the early 1980s, whereas the indexed cost of processed foods like beer, butter, and sodas has gone down since then. And in this community, you're probably pretty happy about the beer. So what all of this does together is to create a food environment in which the government, in conjunction with the food industry, has created an environment that encourages people to eat more than they should or need to eat. And in this environment, eating less and eating better is extremely difficult for individuals. Very, very hard to exercise personal responsibility when food is readily available everywhere, and fast food and sodas don't cost very much. And people are hungry, that's what they're going to eat. So this was the kind of thing that a colleague in Boston and I discussed in the Journal of the American Medical Association, of all places, asking the question, can the food industry play a constructive role in the obesity epidemic? And I have to say, we were dubious about this. And still are dubious, because the goals of industry and the goals of public health are really quite different. The goals of industry are to make money for shareholders, that's their job. The goals of public health are to make people healthier. And while it's theoretically possible that these goals could be congruent and that industry and public health could work together to promote public health, it doesn't work out that way in practice very easily. And that's why I'm somebody who believes in regulation, and I'll just put it out there. I believe in regulation. And I believe in regulation because I think it creates a level playing field that we don't now have. This is a list taken from a publication from the American Heart Association a couple of years ago, in which a committee of the American Heart Association listed all of the different regulatory efforts that had shown some signs of helping people control obesity, and particularly helping children eat more healthfully and not become obese. And this list includes calorie labeling on menus, which I hope eventually we'll have nationally if the White House will ever release the rules. Color-coded food labels, which the FDA has given up on. Bans on toys with kids' meals, which some communities are doing, and then issues about marketing to children, portion sizes, taxes, and subsidies. And I want to say a couple of things about marketing to children and portion sizes and taxes. So that brings me to the whole question of Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign. And I don't know how you feel about Michelle Obama and what she's done in trying to solve the problem of childhood obesity within a generation, but for me it's absolutely thrilling to have somebody in the White House who's interested in the same issues that I am. I think it's kind of terrific. And mind you, she has no legislative authority. She has no rulemaking authority. All she has is leadership. And it's been just amazing to me to watch her exercise that leadership in speeches to the grocery manufacturers of America. I can't imagine how she was brave enough to do this. But she went to the grocery manufacturers and made this incredible speech about how they needed to entirely rethink the way they were marketing, the kinds of information that they were providing about their products and how they were marketing their products to children. And she really put the manufacturers of junk food products on notice that they were going to have to clean up their act, and that they would be held accountable if they didn't. The big accomplishment of the Let's Move campaign, I mean, the big shining accomplishment is the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010, which authorized the Department of Agriculture to set nutrition standards for school foods, all school foods, meals and snacks, and the regulations included limits on the number of times a week that kids could have French fries, and it also included a requirement that there be a certain amount of tomato paste present on a pizza in order to allow the tomato paste to be counted as a vegetable. The food companies who provided meals and food products to school meals didn't like these rules at all, and they spent approximately $5.6 million on lobbying, and their lobbying was really quite successful in some ways, so that Congress, through the appropriations process, put language into an appropriations bill that said that no funds could be used to credit tomato paste based on volume, and that the Department of Agriculture could not put limits on the number of times that French fries were served in school. And that, of course, led cartoonists to have a field day. And this was I like this cartoon so much that it's on the cover of my book, Eat, Drink, Vote, the new Congressional School Lunch Food Pyramid, pizza. So that's the political situation that we're in now, and we're not done with the school meal issues yet, because the school food rules went into effect last year, and about 90% of the schools in America are doing just fine with them. The kids are eating healthier food, and the world has not come to an end. But for reasons that are very hard to fathom, or that are not so hard to fathom, the food companies are still fighting these rules, and they have been joined, oddly, by the School Nutrition Association. This goes under the heading of Politics Make Strange Bedfellows, which has done everything that it possibly can. This is the organization of people who prepare and serve the school lunch meals, the lunch ladies, who are doing everything they can to undermine the Department of Agriculture's rules for school food, and they have lobbied Congress, they've demanded meetings with the White House, they've done a tremendous amount of organizing of their membership, and they've even commissioned their own research to show that the new rules aren't working. And for those of us who are kind of cynical about these things, we cannot help but observe that 40% of the total funding of the School Nutrition Association comes from the very companies that sell these products to schools, many of which do not meet the standards. So this isn't over yet. Congress is still debating these issues, and it's not clear whether the USDA's school food rules will survive. We'll have to see. So all of this is part of food industry strategies for trying to create a better market for their products. They blame personal responsibility. They argue about the science that links their products to health. They promote activity. We're for that. They fund research and make donations to community groups. They get involved with professional organizations. They attack critics like me, and they lobby against public health measures. And when all that fails, they file lawsuits. This is exactly what the cigarette industry did. Food isn't cigarettes, but sometimes the companies behave the same way. So let me give a couple of examples of how this plays out. This is New York City's former mayor, Michael Bloomberg, who in 2012 got the bright idea of putting a cap on the portion sizes of sodas that could be sold in New York City and limiting them to 16 ounces. And he had a big scientific rationale for doing that I won't go into, but I'll just point out that in the 1950s, a 16-ounce soda was considered big. This is an ad from the 1950s that was right at the time when African Americans and other minority groups were asking soda companies to market to them. And this is an example of one of them. But here, a 16-ounce soda is big and serves 3 over ice. During the period that the portion cap was being discussed in New York, Coca-Cola had advertisements saying that small is big news, and here the 16-ounce soda was small. So that's an example of how our perception of portion size has changed over time, and is one of the reasons why the idea of setting a limit on portion sizes was a good idea. Now, the soda industry immediately characterized the soda cap as a ban. It wasn't a ban. You could buy as many 16-ounce sodas as you wanted, and they went to town on lobbying. They formed grassroots advocacy groups that are referred to as AstroTurf, groups that they paid for. They were on social media. They had airplane banners. I live in the city, and I had a home mailing asking me not to let bureaucrats tell me what size beverage to buy. I guess they would rather have the soda industry do that. But the result of that was that it got through all the city units, but then the soda industry sued them, saying that it hadn't gone through the city council, and the courts have agreed that it didn't go through the city council, so the soda cap is dead. However, we now have soda tax ballot initiatives in San Francisco and Berkeley, and soda companies are required to disclose, because it's an election, how much money they're spending on the campaign. And they have disclosed that to date they've spent $9.4 million, $7.7 million in San Francisco and the rest in Berkeley to defeat the measure, which will be voted on in November. Why would anybody spend $9 million on a little city initiative? Well, because the predictions are that the tax in San Francisco would drop consumption by 31%. And just in case the voters go ahead and pass this thing, there are a lot of lawsuits going on as well. And here again, the cartoonists have had a really good time with this, and this was one from Politico, the soda industry's last stand, where the soda tax, people who are for it are being surrounded by missiles of soda. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this comes out, and I'm following it with great interest. The soda tax issues are part of what I see as an enormous national movement to try to have food be healthier for people and the planet. And this movement is not like traditional, movements like the civil rights movement or the women's movement, where there was one goal and one way to go about doing this. There are lots and lots of goals here. There's the organic revolution, the slow food revolution, the locavore movement, the animal welfare movement, and what I like to call the edible movement. And there's no edible in Wyoming, so I had to borrow Idaho's for this. But I think I got the wrong one. I'm sorry. There are 2 in Idaho? Anyway, I'm a big fan of edible magazines, so if you haven't seen them, you should find them. And I think what this movement is doing is talking about advocacy for food that's better for people and the planet. And I think there are two ways to go about this advocating, and both of them are very important. One is to exercise personal responsibility. Choose food, not products, try to eat smaller portions and be served smaller portions, promote local and sustainable food to the extent that you can in the climate that you're in, grow your own food, maybe under hoops or inside, I don't know. Cook at home and teach kids to cook. The most radical thing you can do is to teach kids about food and teach them how to cook. At the same time, I think it's very important that we exercise social responsibility. And here, that we try to change the environment, the political and social environment of food choice, so that it makes a healthy choice the easy choice. And this means working on sustainable agriculture initiatives, and that means changing the Farm Bill eventually, and maybe there's that possibility will come next time. And then there's a whole great big long list of activities and engagements that I think are really worth doing. Improving neighborhood access to food, improving school food, trying to figure out how to stop companies from marketing to children. And then you can get into much larger issues, local taxes and size caps. And then if you want to get into ones that are really big and are going to be very, very long term, to try to change campaign funding laws so we elect legislators who are more interested in public health than corporate health. And I think we need to change Wall Street so it doesn't put food corporations and other corporations under the kind of pressures that they're under to increasingly grow profits, because that's not sustainable in the long run. So I want everybody to join the food movement, to advocate and to take action. And that's the kind of thing I talk about in Eat, Drink, Vote. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to share this with you. So I think we're going and sitting down. Is that what we're doing?
Did everybody find a card on their seat?
It gives you something to do, right?
This is a little present from Christian Banquet, who's the director of FoodSHIFT. And he just wants everyone to have a little take-home message of what they can do for the shift movement. Mine says, plastic bags suck.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Marion. You talked a little bit about calories, and you've actually written a whole book about calories called Why Calories Count with Mal. Can we talk a little bit more about that?
Sure.
Because it seems to me that people don't understand calories at all.
Why would you?
They're,
You're right.
Especially when it comes to trying to lose weight. So do you believe in counting calories? Do you...
Oh no, I don't.
What do you think?
I don't believe in counting calories because it's impossible to do. It's really not possible to estimate the number of calories that you're eating unless you weigh every single ingredient in everything you're eating and look it up in tables and do other things that are very difficult to do. The best way to tell whether you're eating the right amount of calories is to weigh yourself. If your weight's going up, you're eating too many. It's as simple as that.
And what do you tell people who seem to find that they gain a little bit of weight every year, even though they're eating
They're getting
the same
older,
amount?
aren't they?
Yep.
It's the worst thing about getting old. Don't let anybody kid you. The worst thing is you can't eat the way you used to.
You need less calories to maintain your weight.
Fewer calories, a lot fewer calories to maintain your weight. It's no fun at all.
It seems to me that the old conventional wisdom about calories has changed. Doctors used to say to patients that calories in is the same as calories out, and now there's information that calories are not all the same. Could you elaborate on that?
Oh dear. Actually, it depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about weight, it doesn't matter where the calories come from. The body couldn't care less. If you're talking about health, it matters really a lot. And so if you're getting your, you know, the studies are very hard to do, and there really has only been one study that looked at weight loss, changing the composition of the diet, and doing it in a controlled hospital environment where every calorie was measured. And those showed that it made no difference whatsoever. On the other hand, if people are out, what they call free living, out in the world and going on diets of different composition, diets that are higher in fat, protein, or carbohydrate, depending on what the mix is, may be more satiating for people and may make it easier for people to lose weight. The big fad right now is low-carb diets, and for people who cut out a lot of carbohydrates from their diets, they're cutting out a lot of calories. And how to distinguish that is complicated scientifically. On a practical basis, it may not make any difference at all. If you're losing weight and that's what you want to do, great.
I know you're not a fan of dieting in general.
Oh no, certainly not. I love eating.
And you talk about eating everything in moderation.
Oh yeah, if anybody, we're Americans, we don't do moderation. No, I have to say, we were in a restaurant yesterday where somebody at the next table ordered nachos, and it was about the size of Grand Teton. I mean, we were astounded. Maybe that's what they were trying to do there. I mean, it had kind of the same shape. It was amazing.
So do you have an opinion of paleo diet, Atkins diet, raw food diets, the Mediterranean diet?
If they're going to help you lose weight, you're cutting calories, and whichever one of them works is fine. You know, the paleo I find particularly amusing because I think the most important intellectual problem in nutrition is figuring out what people eat. And it's hard enough for nutritionists to figure out what people ate yesterday. And the idea that you could figure out what somebody ate 50,000 years ago and particularly because there's the problem that bones last a lot more than vegetable matter, and so the archaeologists are confused by the whole thing. Anyway, but if it helps you lose weight and you like it, go for it.
So now I have to ask you about grains. What do you think about the theory that grains are bad for our brains? That they may increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias? Yeah,
I remain to be convinced of that. I happen to be somebody who really loves good bread, pasta. I would not want to give those up. It might be worth a few years of Alzheimer's, I'm not sure. I don't know, lots of people think that they're allergic to wheat or sensitive to it, and they may be. Certainly the incidence of celiac disease seems to be increasing by some measures, more than just by diagnosis, and we don't understand that. I don't know what it's about. But, you know, here again, if you feel better not eating wheat, it's not an essential nutrient. You can get those nutrients from lots of other foods. So I don't think it's a big deal.
So let's talk about food fads then. It seems that Americans are ready to grasp at the next food fad every year or so. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's because we're confused by nutrition, or do we just don't have a good sense of what our own food culture is?
Well, I'm not sure we have a food culture, really. It's in our society, other than fast food, which is what characterizes American food culture abroad. And, you know, unless you're in a region that has a particular history like the South, or, you know, certain other regions of the country that have, you know, historic patterns. But fads are fun. You know, I mean, they build a community of this whole community of people who eat gluten-free, and it's such a big community that food manufacturers have actually started in large quantity, making gluten-free foods, which is great for people with celiac disease. It's made their lives a lot easier. I just think they're fun, and because weight loss is so difficult for most people, if you're in an environment where there's food around all the time and everybody's eating and the food is very high in calories, it's really, really hard to lose weight. And so any kind of gimmick or crutch or something that will help people cut down on calories, it seems to me, is something that people want to grasp at.
Fads are fun.
Fads are fun. They're fun.
So we need to talk about the gut microbiome.
Oh yeah, we do.
Because so
everybody
many people
does.
have asked me to ask Marion about this, and I want to hear what you have to say. So there's been a huge surge of interest in fermented foods. People are starting to understand that there are bacteria living in their guts that affect their health. Do you think this is going to be
trillions of
important to the future of health and medicine?
I don't know. I mean, the microbiome stuff is really interesting. It's a few years ago they developed, when these DNA tests came out, it became possible to do DNA tests on the bacteria that were living in the intestine. And before that, it was, something like 80% of feces is bacteria. You don't want to think about that or discuss it in polite company. But there are people who are now looking at the genomes of these trillions of bacteria and correlating them with disease, and there's been a lot of research that's very interesting. I'm waiting for it to play out a little bit more. I think it's still pretty preliminary. But if you eat healthfully, you usually have healthy bacteria in your gut, unless you get food poisoned or something like that. That does mess up things. No.
And do you think that if someone wanted to cultivate a healthy gut flora environment, do you think taking a probiotic tablet is the same as eating foods that are rich in probiotics?
Probiotics are bacteria that are supposed to promote health, and prebiotics are things that you eat to feed the healthy bacteria. Yogurt. The yogurt thing goes back to the early 1900s when somebody wanted to sell, the Bulgarians were trying to sell yogurt and figured out that if they claimed that it kept the gut healthy, that people would buy it, and for some people it works. I think if you just eat a healthy diet with real food, that's going to take care of it.
Do you think that people with unhealthy guts may be because they've been eating too much processed food in their lives?
I don't know the answer to that. I really don't know, but it seems to me that one way, if you're having digestive difficulties, one way to deal with it is to eat a lot of vegetables, with fiber, whole grains, if you can eat grains.
One of the most important messages you tell people is to move more. And as you've already figured out in being here for 2 days is that...
I don't move as much as you do.
You biked up to the park today. That's not true. Everyone here really is a professional or an amateur athlete of some sort. So we actually have problems sometimes from exercising too much and trying to meet our caloric needs to match our activity level.
You're so lucky.
Not everybody, but it was often something that patients would ask me about as well. So what are your recommendations for the adult athlete who doesn't want to fill up on processed food bars, who can only eat so much whole food in a day?
Fat. Olive oil. You want concentrated sources of calories, hopefully as healthy as possible, so make sure all your vegetables are cooked in oil. Fat has 100 calories per teaspoon, per tablespoon. It doesn't take a lot to add the calories.
And do you recommend whole fat dairy products most of the time?
I don't recommend one way or the other. If you're eating dairy products and you don't have to worry about calories, I don't think it's a big issue one way or the other.
And what about our active children? Is there anything different we should be doing with their diets in order to meet their needs?
No, children are supposed to eat the same thing that adults do. Just depending on what age you're talking about, you cut it up in small pieces. Once they're old enough to be so active that you're worried about these kinds of issues, they should be eating adult foods, and the family is eating healthfully, then the kids eat the same thing.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. There's a lot of interest in this community about the whole GMO issue. You've been supportive of requiring labeling of foods that contain GMOs. Do you think the GMO in the food supply will lead to medical problems?
I don't think so. There's not much evidence of that. And the evidence that does exist, I think, really needs to be repeated by independent scientists who do the studies a little bit more carefully. I worry about a lot of the recent evidence that's come out about GMOs causing cancer in rats, for example. I'm not sure. I don't understand the hypothesis behind it, but I think a lot of problems would be solved if they were labeled. And I was on the FDA Food Advisory Committee in 1993 when the FDA, or 1994, when the FDA decided that GMOs not only shouldn't be labeled, but couldn't be labeled. And at the time, I was a consumer representative to the FDA, and at the time the other consumer representatives and I were united in telling the FDA that if they didn't require labeling, it would be a terrible mistake, because it would be bad for the biotechnology industry, because nobody would trust them, and it would be bad for the FDA, because nobody would trust the FDA. And the only surprise is that it's taken 20 years to get to the point where there are labeling initiatives all over the country, and people are really concerned about these issues. I think if they had been labeled right from the beginning, and consumers had a choice, then the market would have decided whether they were going to be sold, and this way nobody has any idea. When I go into a supermarket in the produce section, I know which of those foods has been approved by the FDA to be marketed as genetically modified, but I have no idea whether they're there. And in fact, most people say there's not much genetically modified produce. But Consumer Reports has just come out with a study that says that they just went and looked at products in the supermarket that were labeled natural, and most of them contain genetically modified soy or corn. Is
it true that if it's labeled certified organic, then it is non-GMO?
Yes. Or it's non-GMO below some very small percentage. I'm not sure what the cut point is these days. But if it's labeled USDA organic, the producer of that food must follow the organic rules, and those rules are very, very clear, that there can't be any genetically modified organisms.
I did a supermarket tour today with 4 nutritionists, and we were looking at labels, and we noticed one package of cereal that had the GMO label, as well as the organic label. So they're just...
Well, it must have said no GMO.
No GMO, exactly.
Yeah, GMO free. Yeah, well, that's redundant. But consumers don't know that. So I can understand why they're doing that.
We're all confused.
I'm not.
So what is the flip side of the GMO technology? Can you see it as being a positive thing for world hunger?
Well, that's how it's marketed. And when the industry started, it sold the idea and to the government and to a lot of it, that they were going to solve the world's food problems, that you couldn't feed the 9 billion people that are expected to be on Earth in 20 or 30 years unless you had genetically modified crops. But they never really worked on third world agricultural problems. And they didn't work on those problems because there's no money in the third world to pay for patented seeds and the other kinds of things that they do. So there's one product that I think actually has some use, and that is the genetically modified papaya that was modified in Hawaii, that was modified to resist ring spot virus. So in the skin of the papaya, they become insect resistant, and that did very nice things for the Hawaiian papaya industry. But that's it after 20 years. And
papayas.
And only from Hawaii. And I've talked to people from Hawaii about it, and they said, well, if they hadn't planted the trees so close together, they wouldn't have had ring spot virus in the first place. So they were, they didn't even think that was particularly useful. But so there's lots and lots of talk, but not much action. And the problems that they've dealt with have been first world problems and temperate zone, not tropical zone. Although if climate change continues, these products may not be as successful as they have been to date. And of course there is the problem of Roundup resistance. And that's interesting too, because I once gave a talk at Monsanto in St. Louis. That was a very interesting experience. And I started out with a meeting with the public relations director, and he said, I really don't understand why you're critical about these products. They're perfectly safe. And I said, well, I worry about things like Roundup resistance. And he said, absolutely out of the question. We've been using these things for 70 years. We've never had any problem with Roundup resistance. And I said, but it's a point mutation. Just before I left, I had sense enough to look up what Roundup did. And it was just one, I don't know, for those of you who are DNA people, it's one base pair. The probability of a mutation is very, very high. And of course, we're now seeing so much Roundup resistance in crops in various areas that the farmers have had to go back to using more and more harsh herbicides and pesticides, and they've just approved 2,4-D. Genetically modified resistant to 2,4-D, which means that Agent Orange is going to be spread all over this. It's not a good idea.
And what do you think is the biggest barrier to having states adopt labeling legislation for GMOs?
The amount of money that the industry is putting into fighting it. The amounts in California and Washington State were staggering. $37 million in Washington State of food industry money, and the food industry attempted to hide the source of that money by funneling it through the grocery manufacturers, and they were forced by a lawsuit to disclose who had contributed, and Coke and Pepsi contributed millions, and lots of other food product companies are contributing to these let's stop the GMO labeling campaign. I mean, they must think it's a really serious problem. I'm a little surprised by how scared they are about it, but they're scared.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
Let's talk about the food movement.
I'd much rather.
It seems to me that the food movement has two components. They're the people that are called the foodies, that are really into taking pictures of their food and talking about food and eating and cooking and going to restaurants. And then there's the whole sustainability side where people are interested in food on a deeper level. Do you see these two movements coming together?
Oh, absolutely. I consider myself a foodie. I appreciate good food, and at the same time I'm very concerned about the politics of food. I've made a career of writing and speaking about the politics of food. I see them as inseparable. And it may be that the pleasure of food and the taste of food is an entry point into dealing with much more substantive social issues. So I'm for it any way it comes.
If you were a food activist in Jackson Hole, what would you choose to do that would have local impact as well as national impact?
Well, I think locally I would try to figure out how to grow food here.
I'm sure vertical harvest.
Other people working. I'm not the only one who thought of that. Shucks.
We have a vertical greenhouse that's about to be built.
I don't know about vertical or hoop houses. Although hoop houses under 50 feet of snow might not work. But there must be ways, and even in a short growing season, where you could do at least a little bit, and if nothing, for no other reason than to teach kids about how food is grown. I mean, that seems to me to be something that's really important to do. And otherwise, you're dealing with imports, and then you might as well be in Dubai and getting your food, getting your food from everywhere in the world. So you can't be, if you can't be part of the, well, you could get it from Idaho.
We do get it. Most of our food from Idaho. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, emphasizing that, and it seems to me making sure that the school meals are really terrific for kids, and that connected with school meals are some kind of educational programs, or where food is grown and how food is grown, and teach kids about all that. So they will have kids who are taught what real food is about, mm-hmm. how it's grown, what it is, how you grow it, harvest it, prepare it, eat it, have a very, very different relationship with the food system. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to be great athletes, as which you want your kids to be, or at least active and be mm-hmm. serious about it, you want them well fed and to be eating really healthfully along with that.
Well, speaking of kids, we should probably talk a little bit more about sugar.
Oh, by all means. Big issue right now.
Can you give us an idea how much the typical American consumes of sugar in a day compared to what they're supposed to consume?
Yeah, roughly twice as much. The average across the entire population, man, woman, little tiny baby, is about 400 calories worth of sugar a day, which is 100 grams, which is, I'm not going to be able to do this, divide by, 25 teaspoons, something like that. Really, I mean, it sounds like an enormous amount, but if you're a soda drinker, you're way over that.
Mm-hmm.
And the recommendation is half that amount.
What is your opinion of sugar detox diets?
You mean going cold? Well, a lot of people feel that they're addicted to sugar, and I don't know what to say about that. The addiction literature is mixed on whether you can count it as addictive. It certainly affects the same pleasure centers as addictive drugs and alcohol and so forth, but most people could go cold turkey if they wanted to, but I wouldn't want to. I like sugar.
I know, there goes my morning coffee. Exactly. How do you recommend that parents introduce sugar to children? I mean, babies love breast milk, which is sugary. They have a craving for that. How do you recommend you start feeding a young child and toddler, and how you control the amount of sugar that they get?
Well, you keep it away from them as long as possible. And then, I mean, if you're a parent who's exercising some degree of control over what your kids are eating, you wean them to what you're eating. I mean, and you can cut it up in smaller pieces, or or grind it up and don't add too much salt, or you certainly don't add sugar. You don't need to. Kids don't need sugar. And I have friends who have, I don't have small children anymore, not even close, but I have friends who have small children, and I had lunch one day with a friend and her 8-month-old, and she just took what she'd ordered and cut it up in little pieces and put it on a tray in front of this little girl who just scarfed it down. Now, this is not a picky eater child. If you've got a picky eater, you've got to work at it much harder. And the research shows that new foods have to be introduced 30 times sometimes before kids will accept them. I don't know very many adults who are that patient. So it's hard if you've got a picky eater, but kids are interested in food, and if it's good and if it's in the house and that's what you are eating, kids will eat it. If you don't want kids eating certain foods, you can't have them in the house because you're modeling.
Can you give us a couple tricks about reading food labels at the grocery store?
Well, I hate to tell people how to read the current label because I'm hoping that it's going to be changed.
Why is it doesn't tell you what the percentage of sugar is in your diet?
It doesn't say anything about sugar. Because sugar wasn't an issue in 1994 when that label came out. It's a big issue now, and one of the proposals for the new food label is to list grams of added sugar and do it as a % of daily value, and whether the FDA will do that or not, I have no idea. But that's certainly, where that is now, the FDA came out with proposals for a new food label. It was open to public comment. The comments were in. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of comments. And somebody at the FDA told me they think it's going to be a year to go through the comments. So don't hold your breath.
Don't hold your breath, exactly. I have to ask you about pet food before we stop, but two more before we open up to the audience. I checked out your travel schedule on your blog, and it looks like you travel almost constantly.
Only this month.
Only this month, okay. Do you have any tips for eating well in airports and when you travel, and what sorts of snacks do you take along in your carry-on bag? What's your strategy?
Oh, airports are hard, although they're getting better. Or in lots of places they're getting better. You can always find a salad somewhere, a sandwich somewhere. Even at McDonald's, I like the yogurt parfaits. They're sweet, but they're okay. I mean, you can always find something if you're looking. On the other hand, airports are so horrible that I don't think that's a place where, you know, if it makes you miserable to eat healthfully at an airport, don't. Just get through it. Just get through it.
What is your next book about?
The next book, which as of today has a publisher, very exciting, has a tentative title which probably won't last. It's called Soda from Food Advocacy to Public Health, and that will change at some point, but it'll come out in about a year.
Excellent. My last question before we open it up to the audience is about how to feed our pets. You wrote a book called Pet Food Politics?
I did.
What's the latest advice on optimal diet for cats and dogs?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, and it depends on the role of the pet in your particular family. If the pet is your child and part of your family, you're going to want to feed your pet exactly what your family is eating, except modified for dog or cat. If you think that your dog is a pet, you're just going to buy pet food, and your dog or cat will do just fine. The pet food companies go to a lot of trouble to make sure that their foods are adequate for dogs and cats, and what you hope is that they're following food safety procedures really, really carefully, just as carefully as companies that sell foods to human are doing, so that you don't have melamine in your pet food, which is what Pet Food Politics is about. That was a book that was written about the melamine scandal from several years ago, when unscrupulous Chinese producers substituted melamine for protein, a compound that was used to make plastic dinnerware. And lots of dogs and cats, thousands of dogs and cats died. It was really a shocking story, and I wrote it because I'm very interested in food safety, and I thought that if you could have a food system that somehow allowed this to happen to dogs and cats, that you better worry about the human food system a lot. And of course, just within months of the time that book came out, 300,000 babies in China got sick because there was melamine in their infant formula. So the FDA has changed its pet food procedures since then quite a lot, and has brought the pet food part of FDA much closer into the human food part. So they're much closer. But I read the recall literature, and there are recalls practically every week of one pet food or another. So you do have to be careful, and that's why a lot of people cook for their own.
Excellent. Thank you, Marion.
You're very welcome.
Shall we take some questions from the audience?
Absolutely. Comments, screams, arguments, whatever.
We don't have a microphone, but if you can just speak up and I'll repeat the question. Yes?
You said 14% of the Jackson residents' children are
considered to be food insecure, which means unreliable source of food on a daily basis. It should. Is that right? I just got it off the internet.
I believe there's not as much awareness on this issue as there could be.
Yeah, well, I mean, that has to do with the great divide between, the wealthier people who live here and people who work for the wealthier people who live here. So it's, I don't know enough about how that community is split, but you might want to look into it. It was kind of shocking.
Yes?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
About 15 minutes after they're done. Okay. She says she can do it right after. I'm going to so.
Did everybody hear the question?
Did everybody hear it?
If counting calories is not important, and food labeling is important, and now we have apps to count calories, right? How do you reconcile that?
Mm-hmm.
7:30 they're supposed to be
I guess because it's not my approach. I don't think it can. First of all, you only know about the calories on food products that have labels. You don't know about foods in stores, and you cannot. People are eating half their food in restaurants. How do you know how many calories are in restaurant foods? Maybe there's an app that does that. I've not seen one that, and I have to confess, I'm an electronic dinosaur, so I don't do apps. But if this is the kind of thing that works for you, I think it's great. I don't think it would work for me. And because so much of the calories that you're taking in depends on portion size. And so if you don't know the exact size of the portion, you could be off enormously. But if it's working for you and that helps you control what you're eating, I think it's great.
Yes.
What can we do about childhood obesity? I think you have to change policy. And what I mean by that is you must, I would say the major, most important thing is to stop marketing of junk foods to kids. That is the industry's line in the sand, beyond which they just won't allow it. But I think it's absolutely crucial. In societies in which marketing is controlled better, there's much less childhood obesity. It's not that it doesn't exist, there's just much less of it. So that's one thing. And then we need a huge public education campaign. We need better food in schools and much more opportunity for physical activities. I think children these days are raised in prison is the way that I see it. Unless you live in a community where kids can get out and run around. My own children were free to ride bicycles or go off by themselves. Heaven knows what they did during that period, and I'm so glad they didn't tell me until they were adults. I'm glad I didn't know about it. But I see, I live in New York, and I see what it's like for kids being raised in New York that can't go outside without an adult with them at all time. I grew up in New York as a child, and I had subway privileges from the age of 8. So I could take subways all over the city from the time I was 8 years old. You did that now, your parents would be arrested for child abuse. So that's something that has to change in society. We need safe places for kids to be outside playing and doing something other than screen time. one way or the other. And how you do that, I don't know. But communities in which schools are working on these issues make it much easier for kids to be active and also to be eating better.
Up there?
I couldn't hear.
Is the vegetarian healthier than the meat eater?
That's what the evidence says. There's tons and tons of evidence that vegetarians who eat varied diets that include some animal products or who are very careful to compensate for the missing nutrients are healthier than people who eat an enormous amount of meat. So that it depends on what kind of vegetarian you're talking about, but the Loma Linda, which is the vegetarian, the Seventh-day Adventist medical school in California, does a great deal of this research. And studies for over decades now have shown that the Seventh-day Adventists who adhere more closely to the religious requirements tend to have less heart disease, less cancer, and a lot less of other problems than the people who adhere more poorly. So vegetarian diets are fine.
Yes?
I think it's the latest fad. What coconut oil is? It's the fatty part of the coconut. It's delicious. It really tastes really good. It's highly saturated, and there are big arguments about whether the saturated fats that are in them or the fatty acids are good, bad, or indifferent. I just don't, people don't eat coconut fat the way they eat other kinds of fats. So this is a moderation issue. I think it tastes really good. I like it, and it's the hot current fad. And I had berries this morning, right? Mm-hmm. Sure. The movement is about local, sustainable, organic, and seasonal. And there's a big pressure for restaurants to do seasonal food, but we're in an area now that has 9 months of winter. So seasonal, you're not going to not eat for 9 months. You're not a bear, right? So you need some flexibility here. And so the question is, you want to do regional, and how you define the region. I'm not much of a purist about all of these things. I'm particularly fond of berries, of fresh berries, and in winter, we have winter in New York too, and we do, and so the way I justify buying Driscoll's raspberries in December is that I'm helping Chilean farmers make a living. So think of it that way.
I think we have time for...
You have to be realistic about this. Come on.
We have time for one more question. Yes?
There's one way up there.
Oh, way up there. Okay, we have 2 questions.
I couldn't.
The question, correct me if I'm wrong, is what is the relationship between what you're feeding your children and how they perform in school? Right?
Oh, that's hard. At the most extreme end, it's really easy to tell. Kids who are hungry don't learn. So that's easy. That's been shown over and over and over again, that a child who is not fed adequately is just going to have trouble learning. After that, things get much muddier. Certainly there are plenty of teachers who feel that when the sugary foods are taken out of schools, the kids behave better and learn better. And in the school that I know in Manhattan that I think has the most extraordinary lunch and meal program, it's a private school with a particularly unusual person running the whole program. When he came in and threw out all the junk food and all the sodas and cut down the portion sizes and started introducing international cuisine into the school, the first thing the teachers told him was that the kids were behaving better. So, I don't know, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. It's been very, very difficult to demonstrate with what anybody would consider to be rigorous research. But it makes such sense from a common sense standpoint that why wouldn't you want to feed your kids healthfully and just make sure they have enough and not too much, and that they are getting enough sleep at night. You know, those are the main things that seem to be related to learning. Well, I'm sure there are people who, I mean, there are lots and lots of studies, but they're really rigorous research. It has a lot of trouble with it.
Do we have time for one more?
One more.
Yes, Grace.
Well, actually, I think the Department of Agriculture's rules are pretty good. I don't think they went nearly far enough, but politically they couldn't go any further than they did. I would have every school cooking. And I would do that for two reasons. For one thing, the amount of money that's reimbursed to the schools is not very much from the government. These are all schools that have federally financed school meals. But if the schools that do their own cooking can buy surplus food commodities from the Department of Agriculture and cook them, and sometimes cook them very well. And I've been in schools in some of the poorest areas in New York, and you walk into the cafeteria and it smells good. If you've got a really great cooking staff and the kids are eating the food and it looks like a really happy place. But it requires cooking the foods from scratch, because the minute you start buying the chicken fingers instead of chicken, you're paying somebody to have done the processing, and that takes away from the money that's in the schools. And I have a friend who's a school foods consultant who goes around the country teaching school districts how they can get hundreds of thousands of dollars a year out of federal reimbursements if they do their own cooking. And the food can be much better and of much higher quality. Food, not food products. You know, the food companies make products that are designed to meet the nutrition standards that are set by the Department of Agriculture, and they can turn out whatever product you want. But I've seen food products that meet those standards that have 50 ingredients. I wouldn't want my kid eating something like that. So, you know, you want to support what the Department of Agriculture has done to date, because it's an improvement over what there was before, and then lobby to make it even better.
Good question, thanks. Julia has a few words as we wrap up.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nestle and Dr. Fung. Tremendous thanks are also due to Connie Kimmerer, who is the reason why we were able to bring Dr. Nestle to Jackson. And also to our board member, Zach Hall, who had the idea for this wonderful evening. I also want to thank Dr. Lou Hoheiser, the CEO of St. John's Medical Center, who has made promoting community health and wellness a key component of the hospital's vision. He truly is the reason why we have been able to grow the hospital's wellness initiatives to be what they are today. Let's give him a round of applause. I don't know about all of you, but all of this talk about food has made me really hungry. So fortunately, we have a scrumptious banquet of locally grown food prepared by local chefs right outside these doors. If you have not purchased your wristband yet, you can do so by going straight up to the box office, and you will be able to enjoy that food. And in addition, if you want to learn more about Dr. Nestle's terrific work, you can purchase copies of her books and have her autograph them right behind us on this stage, and the Valley Bookstore has supplied all of those books. So we will be starting that as soon as the curtain lifts. So thanks so much for coming out this evening.